Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction and also for the invitation to come to Tuscaloosa. Now my second visit to Bama. I'm surprised I was allowed to come over the border given that I'm a Tennessee Vol. But they did let me in, and I intend to leave quietly. I do also want to thank Suzanne and George Daniels, Meredith Bagley, who have really done a terrific job, along with Caroline, a terrific job of showing me a great time so far, learning a great deal about the campus, and getting to interact with a great bunch of students earlier today. So thank you very much. All right. As Suzanne alluded to, I'm on Twitter. Oh, it didn't turn on my mic, so that actually may be beneficial for everyone. It's a tough room out there. All right. Is that better? Okay, very good. So to pick up where I left off last time, I am on Twitter. I have no friends or followers, so whatever you can do to help the cause, please do so. The last several years, I've been thinking and writing a lot about civil rights as work. And that for some people, particularly living in communities that have been deeply involved in civil rights action, this may seem to be very obvious. But at the same time, I think there's a tendency sometimes, particularly as we come in the wake of remembering Dr. King, to sometimes not remember really all the work that goes into civil rights. And so by really conceptualizing it as work, I've been pushing in my own writing and pushing myself to think about the fact that even though the civil rights movement and the victories of the civil rights movement and the consequences of it seem to be just laid out almost if they were, inevitable, they've never been inevitable. And in fact, they very clearly could have not happened as much as they did happen. And also have increasingly of the opinion that rather than sort of confining civil rights to the past and discussions of memory, that it really is a discussion about how civil rights is ongoing. And as much as we're the last several days been talking about Dr. King, I actually think it's very beneficial to return to another prominent civil rights leader, Ella Baker. And Ella Baker, I think, wrote and taught very eloquently about the idea that civil rights was actually quite non-glamorous, and it was the spade work of working within communities to organize and to bring people to a point where they could advocate for themselves. And so I'm really, in many ways, enamored with this idea of spade work and thinking about this sort of decidedly feminist, decidedly grassroots idea of what civil rights is. And in having said that, I would encourage you to think about Martin Luther King streets as sites of civil rights work. Not just the work of remembering King, but to what extent are those streets in the past and still today moments and places of civil rights action and mobilization. And so one of the things is one of the big, I think, purposes of my talk today is to give you a different way of thinking about these streets. And hopefully a more empowering way of thinking about these streets. Because I really do believe, and I'll end my talk this way, that they are one of the most important American roads that we have. And I'm going to hopefully establish that idea of why it's an important American road. One of the things that's important to realize is that the naming of streets for Dr. King is really part of the larger work of changing and challenging public memory in the United States. It's really about creating a greater historical national consciousness about the achievements and struggles of African Americans and how we think about the past. And I emphasize public memory because in many ways it's not just the idea that memory is available to us to be seen in a public way, but public memory in terms of publicly who counts within the idea of history. And so if you think about Martin Luther King streets, it's joining a whole host of other commemorative actions that are happening across the landscape, both in reference to King, but also in reference to slavery and in reference to other types of civil rights history. And I think the other thing that's important to realize is that as much as those streets and the naming of those streets is about Dr. King, they're also about larger social justice questions. That in fact, activists who take on the process of naming streets for Dr. King know fully well, and they've expressed this to me over the years, that it's really about determining who has the power to write public memory, given sort of the historical inequities that have surrounded how we remember the past. It's about deciding whose histories are deemed memorable, whose histories are deemed important enough to be elevated to public recognition. And really, it's not just about the past, but it's really very much about who matters socially in the present and in the future. And I think that's a key point, the issue of the future. So when we name a street for King or we do other forms of commemoration, it's not just about commenting on the past. It's really about creating values and projecting those values for future generations. Several years ago, Owen Dwyer and I co-authored a book, Civil Rights Memorials and the Geography of Memory. And in that book, we laid out, I think, pretty well an argument that civil rights memorials, which were really starting to gain a lot of traction on the American landscape, were not just monuments to the movement, but they were actually the extension of the movement, in the sense that they were an extension of the continuing struggle for racial equality and inclusion. And in particular, what we found was that at these memorials, at these civil rights memorials, there were debates and struggles about, well, what part of that history do we tell, whose history gets told, and where does that history get told? That where question is particularly important. Now, I'm a geographer, I'm a little biased, so I tend to think a lot about where, but I hopefully will demonstrate to you today about why the location of where we remember the past can be just as important sometimes as exactly how we're remembering the past. And in fact, they're interchangeable. They accompany each other hand in hand. Oh, by the way, I did want to mention to you, if you are in need of a sleep aid, that book does the job. So, okay, it's a tough room. I do think that this is a particularly special time and a special place right now in the case of the state of Alabama for discussing issues of memory, justice, and sort of grappling with the past. Because we're in a moment and a growing movement of what we call memory work. And that memory work is very much about coming to terms with the past, and in coming to terms with the past, coming to terms with it in such a way that allows us to address current inequalities, allows us to address the tensions and the difficulties that we face right now and will face in the future. Brian Stevenson, who has really put a lot of Alabama on the map, particularly Montgomery, in terms of the memory work that's happening at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice and the Legacy Museum, that is very much part of his vision, is that in fact, in order for us to take on mass incarceration of people of color, in order for us to take on continuing poverty and continuing violence against people of color, we have to understand the past from which those actions came. And so I would suggest to you that I'm very envious you guys being part of the state, but even though Alabama is really involved in this movement's happening across the United States and really taking some very interesting and fascinating directions. I would suggest to you that street naming is really one of the most widespread and the most controversial memorials to Dr. King. We can certainly debate about it, but and one of the reasons I think it's one of the most important is not just because there's so many of them, it's not just because there are intense controversy. I find them to be quite important because they do say so much about where America is at the present, right? So they certainly say a lot about Dr. King, but they also say a great deal about race relations within local communities. And that could apply here in Tuscaloosa, or could apply in Knoxville, where Don and I are from. To give you an idea of how many streets we're talking about, there's at least 955 streets named for Dr. King in the United States. They're in 41 states, the District of Columbia, and although it's not depicted here on the map, also Puerto Rico. It's important to realize that this does not in any way also count the many schools, the many public parks, the many other buildings and structures that bear King's name. Worldwide, we're probably talking well over 1,000 features, 1,000 streets that bear Dr. King's name, according to the most recent data that's been collected. You'll be proud to know that Alabama has the 6th largest number of streets named for Dr. King. I will say that my native home state of Georgia is at the top of the list. That's not necessarily surprising, given that King is also a native of Georgia. But you'll notice that the South has a very important place within this list. That's also not surprising, given the South was the early battleground for a lot of the civil rights movement, and also given the historical concentration and still continuing concentration of African Americans in the region. One of the things that people often ask me when I talk about King Streets is they ask, well, is this sort of a national movement in the sense that the national sort of headquarters of the NAACP or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference sort of orchestrates the naming of streets? And actually, it's far from being that. It is a national movement in the sense that it's taking place across the United States, across the world, but it's actually driven very much at the very grassroots local level by African Americans and white allies, whether that's in local city councils, local county commissions, whether it's local chapters of the NAACP or local chapters of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization that King helped found. And in that way, these streets provide very important indicators to what's going on within those communities in terms of race relations, in terms of the distribution of power, and in terms of how communities remember their past. I think it's important to realize is that these streets are found in not just large metro areas where we tend to sort of focus our attention. Suzanne mentioned Atlanta. I'll talk a little bit about Atlanta in a second, but they're also found in smaller places, and so they're really found throughout the urban hierarchy. In fact, you find Martin Luther King Street in Tampa, Florida. Tampa has one of the longest Martin Luther King streets in the United States, probably on the order of about 14 miles, has hundreds of non-residential establishments that have a King address, cuts across multiple political jurisdictions. You contrast that with the Martin Luther King in Cuba, Alabama, Sumter County, Alabama, which is not nearly as long, not nearly as populated with residents or businesses. And in fact, I probably would not know about Cuba, Alabama's Martin Luther King Street until Marco Williams, who is a documentary filmmaker, actually was putting together the documentary Concrete Dream about Martin Luther King streets. He discovered the MLK in Cuba. He visited it with his camera. He rode along it. He found a gentleman, I think it's probably at the very end of that street, living in a mobile home. And the gentleman's first reaction was, "How did you know we were here?" So in other words, he was a great admirer of King. I think he's now passed away, but he was a great admirer of King. And Marco Williams had this really beautiful discussion with him about his feelings about that street. Now, that street barely shows up on some maps. It certainly doesn't show up on Street View, but it certainly shows up in that gentleman's sense of place and that gentleman's emotional geography. So, again, we have a tendency in America, I think, sometimes to sort of put disproportionate value or weight on certain places versus others, large places versus small towns or rural areas. But I think actually some of the most interesting Martin Luther King streets I've ever encountered have been at what we call in geography the lower end of the urban hierarchy, in small places that maybe don't get very much attention. One of the things that I think I really want to impress upon you today is that there's a tendency when people see that map of Martin Luther King streets, it sort of gives the impression that, well, this is all happening, it's all inevitable, it's all just laid out. It was natural for it to occur. But in reality, naming streets for King comes through activism. It comes through debate. There is no easy road to the question of whether to rename a street, and especially there's no easy road to where do we actually name that street and which street do we name. And in fact, in many cities we have boycotts and petitions that are filed because of the street naming issue. Petitions and counter proposals are put in place. Cities often establish task force. They often have forums where citizens bring and come opinions. There's long, heated public debates about naming. Melbourne, Florida, which these photographs are taken from, it took Melbourne, Florida 32 years to name a street for Dr. King. Now, it did not necessarily fight over that issue for all of those 32 years, but pretty consistently, on an annual basis, they debated that, and they kept throwing up one street versus another street, and they finally just recently actually named Airport Boulevard for Martin Luther King after very much public discussion, debate, and controversy. So one of the things that's important is that these streets, they are expressions of African American and American pride, but they are also sites of struggle. More recently, if you've been paying attention in the news, Kansas City, voters rejected the renaming of Paseo for Martin Luther King, and now that street will revert back to being called the Paseo. And this was actually carried out through a public referendum vote where about 69% of the population that voted in Kansas City voted to remove King's name and to restore it to the Paseo. And I'm not going to get involved in sort of trying to critique or analyze Kansas City. I'm still trying to understand the situation myself, but I want to bring it up to you because I think it's a great example. And in fact, this was a question that came up in George Daniels' class earlier today, which is, do these debates continue? I mean, it's perhaps easy to think about debates happening in the past about street naming, but in fact, they still happen as we speak today. Charleston, West Virginia just renamed a street. I think it's the most recent renaming. I keep a running clock on them. And Charleston, West Virginia just renamed their street. And again, even though it's just an honorary designation, not a full renaming, it also generated considerable debate. I do not know of very many places in America where there has not been intense debate about this issue. And in fact, few places are immune from the conflict. Take Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta, King's home city. They did not rename a street until 1976, a full 8 years after his assassination. If you check out that NBA clip and you ignore the guy named Alderman who's on that clip, it talks, I think in a really nice way, about all the controversy and all the debates that went on in Atlanta. And it wasn't just black versus white. It was within the African American community. It was between business interests and residential interest. It was between city council and regular citizens. There's a lot of different ways in which this can get controversial, including in a city which you would think would be running head first to align itself with King's memory and name. So the big questions in my career that I've tried to take on, and I wanted to try to go through a little bit with you today, is I've been really trying to understand what makes these streets and street names very unique and powerful forms of commemoration. I really want to try to understand why they're controversial. And I think that's probably the question that I will never be able to completely answer, because there's so many different reasons that they are controversial. But I do want to talk about, as a geographer, the where part of that question, and talk about that some of the struggle has to really come down to place. Where do we place King's name within American cities and communities? And I'm also going to end by talking about Martin Luther King street naming as unfinished civil rights work. I'm going to talk about what I mean by that. And this is not me necessarily projecting my voice onto this issue. This is what I've heard many activists, many communities, many planners talk to me about over the years. And I want to be very clear right here. And I have to sort of check my positionality at the door as a white Southern male, that when I talk about some of these struggles and I talk about some of these issues, I can't fully understand them the way that other folks can. And I also want to make sure that I'm very clear about the idea that I'm speaking about these conflicts and struggles, and I'm not speaking for those communities, all right? But I do want to share what I've tried to pick up and learn along the way. And one of the things I would really want you to understand is that it's very easy to see streets and see names as very innocuous, almost unimportant. In fact, when I first started my dissertation work, which was on street naming, I remember calling a city manager, and I will not repeat the name of the city in Georgia for fear of embarrassing that public official. This is where you're supposed to laugh. And I remember asking that public official, because I was trying to figure out, well, when did your city name its street for Dr. King? Well, why in the world do you want to know that? This is what he said. And I said, well, I'm working on my dissertation. He said, that is the most inane topic. You've got to get a different topic. And so a lot of folks react to this topic this way, but I want to suggest to you that these streets, they're deceivingly complex, right? They really are very complex places. They're symbolic landscapes, they're lived and felt places, and they're the centers of intense identity. Whether you are a proponent of them and you live along those streets, or actually you are an opponent, you oppose the street naming. They mean a great deal to people, even though they want to suggest to you that they don't, right? One of the reasons, or one of the ways that Martin Luther King streets are important symbolically is that they do not exist in a vacuum. They are part intertextually with other memorials to the Civil Rights Movement. So in other words, some Martin Luther King streets help lead you to other memorials that you can find. Take Raleigh, North Carolina, which I have pictured here. You go along Martin Luther King in Raleigh, it leads you to a park where you have a statue of Dr. King. You also have a water monument there. And by the way, the people remembered on that water monument are not national civil rights leaders. They are local civil rights leaders and activists and workers. So it's a way of bridging the national memory and the local memory in some very interesting ways. You go to Jackson, Mississippi, and you have Freedom Corner, which is where roads named after Medgar Evers and a road named after Dr. King intersect. Both very big martyrs within the civil rights movement, very important figures. We also have roads dedicated to Rosa Parks and King that intersect. We even have Coretta Scott King, who increasingly now is getting more and more attention for her important roles in the civil rights movement, remembered on a street sign in Jacksonville, North Carolina. I don't have it pictured here, but there's places and various places in the United States where Malcolm X and Martin Luther King intersect as roads. Now keep in mind, this intersection of roads is a little deceiving because we're talking about very different historical figures that had different takes and different work within the movement, and they seem to be brought together very harmoniously. But remember, it's part of creating a larger commemorative path that leads us to thinking about American history, American memory in different ways. Some Martin Luther King streets draw meaning by marking places in King's biography. In Selma, Alabama, which is one of my favorite Martin Luther King streets, along that street you had the Brown Chapel AME Church, which was the starting place for the Selma to Montgomery March that was so pivotal for the Voting Rights Act. You had the George Washington Carver homes where King and other activists stayed and strategized during that chapter. You go to Harlem, New York, the Martin Luther King in Harlem, New York. Along that very street in 1958, King was stabbed with a letter opener by a troubled, mentally ill woman, an African-American woman. And if that letter opener had not missed his heart by just a matter of an inch, we probably would have lost Martin Luther King in 1958 rather than losing him 10 years later in 1968. St. Helena, South Carolina, where the Penn Center is located along Martin Luther King. It is one of the first schools for freed slaves in America, certainly in the South. It is along the Penn Center that SCLC held workshops. King would often use it as a refuge to get away from the hustle and bustle of the movement. He would strategize. So again, some of these streets are deeply embedded within King's biography. It's natural that they would be there. But keep in mind, don't all streets bear King's legacy, right? And so again, this is my second most favorite Martin Luther King street. Pawleys Island, South Carolina, very modest, not much development along that road. You go along that road, you encounter a monument. And on that monument, on the side of the road, reads, honoring a world citizen who never walked this road, but whose life's works helped all those who do. And it makes the point that whether King was on that road, and he traveled millions of miles in his career, whether he was on that road or not on that road, his name belongs because of the impact that he had on people, and particularly the people in that community. So there's a real bridging of local, national, regional memory here in some ways that I think is quite provocative. Keep in mind that street naming builds directly onto the MLK holiday that we're coming out of. The MLK holiday, passed and first observed in the 1980s, created King as a federally recognized icon. It created a legitimacy for remembering him that then has been carried over and has been used to justify street naming. It's not by accident that many of the streets that become named for King, when do they hold the dedication ceremony? Martin Luther King Day. It's also important to realize that as much as the holiday led to more streets being named for the civil rights leader, is probably what the holiday could not do that also led to King's commemoration. Think about a holiday. Holiday comes once a year. Some people may observe it, some people may not, right? And communities have told me that one of the things that they wanted is they wanted a more permanent and more physically tangible, a more year-long way of remembering King. And for them, naming streets for Dr. King was the most accessible way they thought of doing that. Here's what's interesting. Some of the early activists who led some of the earliest campaigns for naming streets for King tell me that one of the reasons that they chose street naming, because you could build monuments, you could build museums, now those cost money, but one of the reasons they chose streets is they actually thought it would be easy. They actually thought it would be a relatively stress-free, sort of a nice way, an easy way for a community to recognize Dr. King. And what they found instead was exactly the opposite, which we'll talk about. The symbolic power of street naming, and I don't want to spend a great deal of time on this, this is what I geek out about, right? So I sit around thinking about, well, what makes streets so powerful symbolically? Why is it that people want to name streets? What role do street names and addresses play in our lives? Well, as I already mentioned, a street address or a street name makes the past tangible and familiar. It weaves history into everyday settings and performances. Think about this for example. Think about your own address. Think about how that address pops up in so many things that you do. From putting out mail, putting that address on your mail going out or in, or if it's about you giving directions to your home, or whether it's actually talking about a busy thoroughfare, seeing that address up on a billboard. So something as simple, or what was seen as simple as street naming, was really about creating a larger city text that revolved around the remembering of King. And again, think about your address as not just a way of getting mail, but your address is a form of what we call an identity narrative. It's a way for you to identify yourself. Think about what an address does. If you look up there at the screen, you got my name, and you have where I live, Knoxville, Tennessee. Think about how the street address bridges our identities. It bridges my personal identity with where I live in such a way that it positions me. And that situating and positioning of people is quite powerful. And then finally, roads are potentially powerful as forms of commemoration because they have the potential to connect different people and places. Think about how roads connect different neighborhoods, different business districts. Think about how they cut across county boundaries. They even connect different jurisdictions. So roads have a connectivity that many activists sought to leverage as part of the commemorative movement. But keep in mind that roads also are important boundaries. So roads don't always connect different neighborhoods. They often divide those neighborhoods, which can be a problem. The Martin Luther King in St. Paul, Minnesota, the state leaders in Minnesota decidedly chose the state capitol as the place where they wanted King remembered on a street name, exactly for the reason of visibility and connectivity. And in fact, the gentleman who led the effort for the state government in Minnesota told me that he wanted it where every school kid that visited the state capitol on their buses, they pull their buses up, they would see that the state capitol was on a King Street. It's a very relatively small street, but it brings a visibility, it brings a recognition that in fact goes beyond simply having monuments and museums and other standard memorials. So what I'd like to do now is shift to talking a little bit more about why and how Martin Luther King streets are controversial. I've suggested in a lot of my writings that Martin Luther King streets are arenas. I've tried to sort of coin that term for talking about commemorative landscapes. But they're arenas. They're places, public spaces where we interpret and debate King's legacies. They're where we grapple with questions of race and racism. They're also places where we struggle over the rights to the city. And I want to emphasize that. And I don't want to bring in too much French social theory here, because that's always a snoozer. But when we think about the right to the city, we think about the idea that there's always in every community this interplay, this competition for, in fact, who can have a voice, who can have expression within their communities. And these streets are often the arenas for those types of struggle, well beyond what it may say about King and well beyond what it may be saying about race relations in general. There is a clear power field going on along streets. And in fact, if you think about where best to commemorate King, that question, and by the way, the Hotel Capstone is a fantastic hotel here in town. It so inspired me, I developed this graphic last night. This is why it does not look very good, but this is what happens when you use PowerPoint Smart Art. But I've been wanting to come up with this graphic for so long, and I'm actually pretty happy about it, because a lot of folks don't quite understand all the many different political stops that are along the way when you try to rename a street. So think about the fact that one of the key components to naming streets for King is, where do we commemorate him? Where best do we commemorate him? Which street do we choose to name for King? And again, that is not an easy question. It's not an easy issue to settle. In fact, what it involves is openly taking on King's legacy and figuring out, okay, what sort of reputational account of King do we embrace? What is our memorial agenda here? What do we want to achieve by remembering King? What King do we want to remember? Do we want to remember a King as a radical figure? Do we want to remember King in a more conservative way? Do we want to remember King as a hero to all of America or only to African Americans? Those reputational accounts are at the core of figuring out where best to remember him. It also has to do with choosing the location of the street and evaluating it in terms of length and prominence of the street. Who's going to be affected by the street name change? And then you always have to look at this in the context of the wider history and geography of the city's racial and class divides. In fact, you can't evaluate any street, and you really can't evaluate King's legacy without considering what has happened in that community in terms of race relations. What's happened in terms of where people are located? How rigid are the boundaries between communities? And how will that rigid boundaries affect when we want to actually name streets in ways that maybe violate those boundaries? And then finally, it is always an issue of the distribution of power. What is the political process of naming public space? What is the political process of claiming public space? And not everybody, and I'm sure hopefully this is not late-breaking news, not everybody has full access to power at the local government level. Certain people have a greater voice than other people. And so what I suggest to you is that there's a place politics to public memory. Many proponents, not all, but many proponents want to rename highly visible thoroughfares that cross racial and economic boundaries. And part of their reason for this is that they certainly want to recognize King with what they see as very prominent, proper memorials, with places that sort of evoke sort of a dignity that's becoming and that King deserves. But it's also because they're trying to educate the wider community within their town about King's importance, particularly those communities that have not traditionally thought about the importance of King or the importance of African Americans historically. But unfortunately, opposition frequently leads to what I call sort of a racialized scaling of King's memory. Now, that's just a very fancy word for the fact that many of those renamed streets, not all of them, are confined to largely African American and poor neighborhoods. And there's an intentionality here. One of the things that I would certainly battle against is the idea that many times we, our students, our neighbors, we look at the landscape, we look at how everything is laid out, and we just assume it's always been that way. But in fact, behind every landscape is an intentional decision about why it looks the way it does and how it came to be the way it is that we see today. Take Chicago as an example. Very first street named after Dr. King was in Chicago, Illinois. That street is a large, massive street that runs through the black South Side. It was formerly called South Parkway. The decision to name that street was very much intentional. The original proposal to name a street for Dr. King, which, by the way, came months after his assassination, was about actually naming a road that runs through the Central Business District, naming a road that was part of an expressway that was proposed to go in and around the city. And instead, Richard J. Daley that made the decision, made the proposal, and was able to force through the idea that this street, largely confined within the black community, would bear King's name. And Daley was no friend of King's. He used the street naming actually as a way for him to buttress his own reputation, to actually make the argument that he was racially progressive when he actually was not. And so you have to wonder, even though this is a proud street dedicated to King's memory, there is an underlying history of political struggle that we have to recognize in order to fully understand how it came to be. It takes nothing away from the people who live on that street. It takes nothing away from the development that's going along on that street. I used to live in Greenville, North Carolina. We used to live in Greenville, North Carolina. I think I was living with you. My wife Donna's down front here. The crowd's fading on me. That's why I'm talking to you. We lived in Greenville, North Carolina. I taught at East Carolina University. Greenville's an interesting case. 1999, the local African American community pushed the city of Greenville to name West 5th Street, or they wanted all of 5th Street named for Dr. King. The city was not willing. They were willing to name West 5th Street, but not East 5th Street. West 5th Street is predominantly African American. East 5th Street, predominantly white. It basically is absolutely the classic racial divide that you find in many southern communities and communities in general. After 1999, they got West 5th Street named for King. Every year after 99, they went back to the city council. Every year. We want all of 5th Street. We want East 5th Street with King's name on it. In fact, one of the activists had a beautiful quote. It should be the quote on a book cover. A whole man deserves a whole street. All right, I'm getting a little emotion out there. That's good. Well, guess what? All the way up into the mid-2000s, they kept bringing the proposal up. The city council refused to budge. They would not rename the eastern part of the street. Finally, the city council says, look, we're tired of this. We're tired of this controversy. And you know what they did instead? They removed King's name from what was once West 5th Street. They moved King's name to the bypass outside of town. So now if you visit Greenville, that whole street is back to being 5th Street. So that was how far the city council was willing to go to reinforce a segregation of memory. And that was a segregation that wasn't just about the segregation of how King is remembered. It was a segregation that dated back to the days of Jim Crow and even earlier. And in fact, this was a struggle over two histories. Not just how you remember King, but how do you remember and deal with the history of that particular street? And in fact, a lady that I interviewed who lived on West 5th Street, which was then Martin Luther King, told me a story that when she was a little girl, she was told repeatedly, you never go over into East 5th Street. That was a demarcated boundary that, in fact, it was made very clear to her as a black child in Greenville that you did not belong on that street. And so you can imagine the kind of emotion that folks felt who lived along West 5th Street when they could not try to gain access and claim some of that public space. A lot of times the arguments are really almost a a form of NIMBYism in a different way. It's very much about not being on my street. So some of the most vocal opponents are residents and business owners on affected streets. They give a whole host of arguments. We could have a whole lecture on just what those arguments are and what they mean. I can't do it here right now. They range from people worrying about the loss of their street's original identity, the place heritage that can develop between people's memories and lives and the address that they've long identified with, the cost and inconvenience of an address change, which I think is becoming less and less of a relevant argument given our digital age that we live in. They also sometimes say that there's a fear that property values will decline. So this taps into the idea that some people believe that there's a stigma that surrounds naming a street for Dr. King. And I've actually heard people and have interviewed people and put on the record that they have told me that naming a street for King somehow will bring more crime. It will bring more drug trade. It will bring blight. And what this has got to do with is the opponents are perpetuating, and media as well in some cases, a stigma that surrounds these streets. And what all that reveals is really deeper anxieties that people hold about their neighborhoods and their boundaries. These same arguments are not that far from what we heard during the days of segregation, when African Americans were attempting to bust through all white neighborhoods to claim those homes and those spaces for their own lives and livelihoods. And there is some reality to the idea that these streets are sites of struggle, social, economic struggle. It's not, I would be lying to you to suggest that every street named for Dr. King is somehow a rosy picture. Life can be very difficult on some of these streets. And some of these headlines here, I think, capture this, from ideas about crime to food deserts to the abandoned properties, the loss of buildings, the loss of development. But instead of us sort of saying, well, the stigma is true, I would encourage us to think about, well, how is that stigma keeping us from really seeing the complexity of these places? And what I've actually found is there's a lot of competing emotions about naming streets for Dr. King, particularly amongst the communities that live along those streets. On one hand, they're often very, very proud to have King as their address. And at the same time, they also often express deep emotion and sadness about the fact that they, in their words, do not have a more proper, more fitting memorial to King. Some activists argue, on the other hand, that in fact, if you were going to put King's name anywhere, you put it in a neighborhood that is in need of social economic justice. That in fact, it could be a very fitting memorial. So there's a lot of competing emotions as you sort of reconcile King's name and memory with the actual spaces and the types of ways of life that you find along those streets. And in fact, that stigma, and I've come to the opinion the last couple of years that stigma probably does a lot more damage than good. And in fact, that stigma damages the public's ability to see these streets as communities. And in fact, those communities are composed of prominent churches. Those communities are composed of barbershops and beauty salons. And by the way, churches and beauty salons and barbershops, they were pivotal within the civil rights movement. They were sites of mobilization. They were refuge from discrimination. I've never met a barbecue restaurant I didn't like. They also tend to be the location of a lot of great barbecue restaurants. I just got back from Northport, saw Archibald's there. Did not have a chance to sample the delicacy, but barbecue restaurants were also played a role in the civil rights movement, as well as being gathering places in today's world where people can feel like they belong and express themselves. Greensboro, Alabama. If we stick to the stigma, we forget, or we're damaged in our ability to recognize the kind of history and placemaking that's happening in Greensboro with the Safe House Black History Museum that's there. So again, I'm not suggesting there's not struggle along these streets, but if we give into the stigma and we give into the stereotype, we're missing a really rich, complex place. Stigma also ignores the significant development that's happening on some of these streets. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Savannah, Georgia, two of many examples of cities that have pushed a lot of money towards developing their Martin Luther King streets. Savannah, Georgia, I don't know how many have gone to Savannah, Georgia. The Visitor Center, Savannah, Georgia now has a vibrant tourism economy. Some suggest that it's actually squeezing people out. That's for another day. But that tourism economy, its Visitor Center has a Martin Luther King address. When you go to that Visitor Center, and there's probably about 10 million people that pour through that Visitor Center every year, they land at Martin Luther King. You go to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Milwaukee is pumping a great deal of money into redevelopment. Their goal is to actually make it the best in the nation. There's that kind of sort of, again, you stick to the stigma, you don't recognize this. You stick to that stigma, you don't recognize the incredible redevelopment that's occurring right here near you, right? Whether it's the road improvements that are planned for Northport with the installation of sidewalks and walkability and just general road improvement, or Tuscaloosa, where I just returned with George Daniels, where we got a tour of the new Martin Luther King Elementary School. We've seen all the churches around there. We saw the library. A lot of, with that stigma, we forget the institutions that create this part of America. We also forget, because of that stigma, that these streets are sites of activism. So I'd like to tell you the story of Austin's Martin Luther King Street. Austin was dealing with the very same issue that Greenville, North Carolina dealt with. Austin had 19th Street, and Austin faced a very critical decision. Do we rename both sides, east and west of 19th Street, or do we only name one side of 19th Street, that side that tend to be more aligned with the African American community? Well, Austin actually decided not to. It decided to rename all of 19th Street for King. Then the Austin City Council came under tremendous opposition and pressure. So they reconvened, and like a lot of city councils, they started backtracking. And so they were about to basically rule that Austin's street naming would be rescinded and that King's name would only be on part of 19th Street, until J.J. Seabrook came onto the scene. Dr. J.J. Seabrook, professor emeritus at a local African-American college there in Austin, goes before the Austin City Council in the 1970s. He argues impassionately for keeping King's name on that road, all of that road, and he dies on the spot of a heart attack in that city council. And it doesn't matter what kind of cheap politician you are, you cannot fight against that. And that name stayed on that road. And so in many ways, Austin's Martin Luther King Street is as much a memorial to J.J. Seabrook as it is to King. And by the way, if you go to Austin, Texas, which is a place that really fancies being weird, don't know why, but they do, you will see that there's actually a side road off of Martin Luther King called J.J. Seabrook. And so now you know the story. You go to Austin to be weird, you can actually sort of make sense of it all right? I think some of you actually need to go get weird, because you're really worrying me. You're really worrying me. Chattanooga, Tennessee, 1981. This is actually the street naming struggle that first got me interested in this topic. 1981, African-American community activists wanted to rename of all of 9th Street, the Big Nine, as they call it in Chattanooga. The city council did not want to. They only wanted to rename part of 9th Street that aligned with that racial boundary that we talked about. And so what did leaders do? On one Saturday, 1981, armed with ladders, armed with bumper stickers that said Martin Luther King, they went from signpost to signpost, shellacking King's name on top of those street signs, temporarily but defiantly renaming that street. They did the very same thing in Seattle, Washington, if you read up on Seattle, Washington. And indeed, they won the day. They created a very strong coalition between vocal African-American activists and clergy and white allies, and they pulled it off in Chattanooga. We also, because of that stigma, sometimes don't realize that there is the important role that white allyship can play in these struggles. New Bern, North Carolina, I don't know how many know about anything about New Bern, North Carolina. Some people don't. How many, raise your hand, this is participation. How many have ever drank a Pepsi Cola? How many have ever drank anything? All right, there you go. All right, if you ever drank a Pepsi-Cola, Pepsi was invented in New Bern, North Carolina. And Martin Luther King in New Bern, North Carolina is a very prominent thoroughfare, over 200 non-residential establishments. It goes for quite a distance. It connects the traditional African-American community in with a more commercial thoroughfare. And in fact, one of the reasons that that street was able to be renamed, not the only reason, but one of the reasons was Mayor Tom Bayless, who was mayor then, and he was convinced and he was determined to make sure that King's name was on a prominent thoroughfare. And then this is a great quote from Tom Bayless. MLK doesn't belong just to black people. This is his view. The fact of the matter is he freed everybody in this country. He caused me as a white American not to have to live a lie. And so it's important to realize is that stigma and the way it racializes the way we see places and the way we see people and the way it encourages us to forget the complexity and the humanity of these streets, that in fact you can have very important white allies. So I know I'm getting close on time, but I want to try to end by talking about some of this unfinished civil rights work. What is the unfinished civil rights work? And I have to admit, I was so taken with and so impressed and so thankful to get an invitation from the College of Communication and Information Science, because I really do believe that some of the unfinished work are places where geographers and those in communication and information can bond together, collaborate, and really do some good. And hopefully this will come out in the last remarks here. So one of the unfinished pieces of business is that there are communities right now who are attempting to extend the scale and the place of commemoration and belonging. So in other words, they're wanting not to just keep King's name sort of bounded by the traditional boundaries of race and racial neighborhoods, but they're wanting to extend it. Tulsa, Oklahoma, which has its own highly charged racial history. Tulsa, they have been trying, they're still trying to actually extend King's name down all of Cincinnati Avenue. I don't think they're successful yet, but this is part of their own mobilization. Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Raise your hand if you've ever been to Chapel Hill, North Carolina. All right. Chapel Hill, North Carolina has an interesting story. Chapel Hill, for many years, had a Martin Luther King Street. It was a very, very small street, tucked away near a public housing project. That street did not show up on many maps. In fact, when I went hunting for it, I had to ask directions. I was with a grad student of mine, the one who owns that truck, and we had to ask. We never could find it on a city map. And actually, city officials and activists in that community reacted to that. They recognized they wanted something bigger. They wanted something more prominent. They wanted to extend King's name in ways that people would see, and it would pop up on maps. And so they chose Airport Road. Very, very controversial choice. I did not realize that so many people could identify with the word airport, but they do. And in fact, they put up such a fight. But I will say that the city council, I think, did the right thing. They held the right kinds of meetings. They did the right kind of education. And they eventually renamed Airport Road for Dr. King. And that happened in 2005. Now, I will say that what they really practiced was really very much King's teachings. Letter from the Birmingham jail, which many people are now talking about around this MLK holiday. King talks about the difference between positive peace and negative peace. Talks about the positive peace of social justice, the negative peace of basically maintaining social order. And so the people in Chapel Hill, they made a determined effort that they were going to take on social negative and positive peace, that they were going to do what was the positive peaceful solution, establishing justice, versus falling back into just maintaining social order, which was to keep Airport Road, Airport Road. It's also been, I think this is to me one of the more exciting parts, an expansion of who counts as a civil rights hero on the city text. And one of the things that we've seen lately is that now there's a growing number of streets being named after female civil rights activists. And there's a discovery of the important role, a rediscovery rather, of the important role that women played in the civil rights movement. So in Chicago, they have now an Ida B. Wells Drive. Harlem has taken on the task of renaming a lot of streets after prominent African-American women. Ella Baker has her own street there in Harlem. Greensboro, North Carolina has renamed Aycock Street, named after a very highly charged political figure, to Josephine Boyd Street, after a local figure, African-American woman who was part of the desegregation of the public schools. So again, a lot of communities I speak with are telling me and really showing me that they're wanting to not just stay within the confines of King. The unfinished work is to broaden who counts within how we think about and remember the civil rights movement. But we have to be, I think, careful, because it's very easy to believe that you get a street renamed, even a prominent street, and the battle is done. There's a lot of communities are increasingly telling me that they recognize that, in fact, that's just the beginning of the battle. That, in fact, they worry that officials are using place renaming for political expediency. That, in other words, city councils will rename a street and say, okay, you've gotten what you want, now let's change the subject to something we want to talk about. And so many communities are very, very worried about this. And they want there not to be a changing of the subject. They want that street name to be sort of a jumping off point for talking about larger racial injustices and wounds. And so even a very progressive name reform can actually deny justice rather than do justice if it's not done in the correct way. And so communities now are very much about linking the symbolism of street names to the socio-economic lives and livelihoods of the people on those streets. In other words, they want the street naming to count for something in a larger way. So again, not to be too theoretical and bring in a bunch of French theorists, they want to see the street name as sort of an assemblage. They want that street name to be part of something larger that then together creates meaning, rather than it being just the sole goal. Melvin White, I've had the great honor of working with two organizations over the last few years. Melvin White in St. Louis, Missouri, the Beloved Streets of America, whose goal is to revitalize Martin Luther King streets across America. And he's had a lot of struggles, but he is always in there pitching the ball. Terrence Dix, who we get a lot of phone calls at home from Terrence Dix out of Augusta, Georgia. And Terrence and I are in the process now of pitching a proposal to some foundations where we would actually carry out economic development, leadership planning, and promotion at a grassroots level with other communities in the state of Georgia. And in many ways, Terrence he's a great admirer of King, but he's really pulling out an Ella Baker model of mobilization. Keep in mind that when we talk about redevelopment or development, it's not just about any development, it's about whose development. So sometimes it's important to realize that you may see development along a Martin Luther King street, but if that is gentrification and displacement, then is that really benefiting the people who have long lived and drawn identity from that place? So there's a real emphasis now on communities as part of the unfinished work of making sure that it's a very socially responsible, sustainable form of development that does not kick out the people who matter most to replace them with people who want loft apartments. And so I would suggest to you that, and this is my final point, is that I think that one of the greatest things that geographers and those in communication and scholars in general can do is carry out reparative storytelling. So when I was president of the AAG, I did a presidential address where I talked about what reparative storytelling is. You can look at that online, again, if you have trouble sleeping. And reparative storytelling is not just, okay, let's tell nice stories about Martin Luther King streets. Let's tell stories, let's mobilize those stories in such a way that they actually change people's attitudes. They get people thinking about the struggles, the needs, the dignities of those streets. And it actually is actionable knowledge for addressing social and economic justice. And so I would suggest to you that we've got to have these reparative stories to move beyond those stereotypical stigmatizing stories that we see too much on Twitter, the news, and from opponents. Seldom do we discuss right now in the media and in public society the wider story of Martin Luther King streets, how they came to be named, how the histories of structural racism and disinvestment have affected them. and how they are places of resilience and anti-racism. And so this reparative storytelling would be about trying to put these streets in a context, using narrative, using technologies, using the stories from the residents themselves to make sure that we understand how these streets came to be and what they can mean to remembering King, but also what they can remember to the future of our country. And so I want to, everyone always says, well, I'm about to end. I'm really ending here. I want to bring your attention to what I think is a particularly good reparative story written by Tanvi Misra, a staff writer with City Lab. And she has written a piece, it was published last year, a couple of years ago now, where she talks about Baltimore. And it's a really elegant piece that talks about the struggles that people face on Baltimore's Martin Luther King Street. But she does a great job of telling you sort of the biography of that street. Really how that street has become shaped and reshaped and formed by the racial dynamics and income dynamics in that city. Even to the point where she's using maps. And that's not the only reason I like this article, right? But if you look at those maps where the green is indicated proportionately or disproportionately African American, the pink and sort of the purple is largely white. The lighter shade is their lower income. The darker shade is higher income. You can see how that street is what Jane Jacobs called a border vacuum. It is a boundary between different parts of the city that do not have equal access to power and equal access to the same trajectories of life. And it's not about painting West Baltimore as a bad place. And it has struggles. It's about painting it and picturing and depicting it as a place in which people know that they are facing struggle. They're mobilizing against it, but they are facing it because facing obstacles that didn't just happen in their lifetime. They've been developing for a long period of time. And so I would suggest, and again, I'm not saying this is perfect, but it's only by having this kind of reparative storytelling that we can start taking collective responsibility for these streets. And I think that's absolutely what's needed if we're going to fully and I think justly remember Martin Luther King. And if we're really going to live up to his teachings about the beloved community. And if we're truly going to think about what we want America to look like, not just in terms of on this time in January, but all year long. And this is what these streets do. These streets lead us to thinking about that. They're the great American road. They lead us to thinking about King. They lead us to thinking about how we now look versus what King wanted to see. These streets embarrass us. These streets inspire pride in us. These streets tell our story. But we have to go and discover that story. Thank you. Yeah.
Prefer that you say it's actually, Martin Luther King Jr. Drive,
Yeah.
the full nomenclature. And so I was just wondering if you had actually looked at that.
No, I haven't looked at it systematically. I think it's a great point, great question. And I've run into the very same thing, that there's a politics, linguistically speaking, of how one refers to Dr. King. And in fact, there tends to be pretty strong feelings about making sure that his full name is on that street. I mean, partly because they do not, the folks behind it, they want him fully remembered. And they also do not want cities to take shortcuts by shortening the length of that name and for there to be any confusion about whose street, that street, who it belongs to. sometimes with cities, the issue of what kind of nomenclature they use has to do with the length of signage. So, in fact, Atlanta, when it renamed Hunter Street and Mosley and part of Gordon Street for King, it had to order a whole new length of sign, which I think cost the city somewhere at that time in the 70s about extra $4,000 or $5,000. And they had to secure it because when you have a sign that long, it can be a bit dangerous with the wind. So some cities face they sort of more practical concerns, but there's a wide variety of nomenclature. But your read on that is correct. There's a politics to how we say Dr. King's name, and that's very important to the street naming struggle. Yeah.
As I have been doing some reading during this holiday or reflecting upon Dr. King, I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
Whenever I drive to a city, I often feel a greater sense of comfort and security when I get to MLK Boulevard.
Yeah.
Because I said to myself, somebody's going to be there that kind of looks like me. But I was reading this quote from Mark Lamont Hill, who says, he's writing yesterday, "Today, let us remember Martin Luther King as he was, a black radical anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, revolutionary Christian who died as an enemy of the state. Anything else is just a lie."
Yeah.
Now, I offer that because the whole idea around the signage of the streets is given a sign of, quote, "we have overcome," unquote. But under that, embedded in that word is the struggle.
Yeah.
The redistribution of power that is absolutely necessary in order to achieve these goals in these different cities that you went to. And so, Lamont Hill and many others have talked about our being careful about romanticizing
Yeah.
who Dr. King was and the strategies he had to utilize in order to make this country live up to what it said it was going to be. And that comes out so much in your work as you talk about the politics and politricks
Yeah.
along with
Yeah.
these street names.
Yeah, so you guys probably wouldn't guess that there were slides cut out because it went so long, but a couple of slides that got cut out is that what's interesting is that depending on where you go with the street naming debate, you sometimes go to communities that say actually very little about King and his reputation. People just assume that they know who you're talking about and what he meant. And then you have some communities where there's a deep debate about his legacy. And what's amazing is that there are some street naming activists that actually bring out the more radical King in suggesting that they want more radical solutions on the landscape. And what's also amazing, though, and embarrassing, is that there are some opponents of street naming that they appropriate sort of King's legacy in ways to suggest that somehow King would never want to rock the boat. In fact, there was in Greenville, North Carolina, the case that I mentioned to you, the local community there said, well, look, if we're not getting some progress on this issue, I say we boycott. Well, let's have a boycott and send a message about how we feel about this. And one of the city council people, who obviously was not a supporter of this, said, well, Dr. King would never advocate for boycotts. He would never advocate for people to be put out or to be in a situation of discomfort. And everybody just looked around. And so I think, honestly, part of the thing we have to be careful of is not just forgetting those streets, but also forgetting who King really was. Exactly. And I think that's part of the unfinished work, is in fact recovering and I think breathing more life into those depictions of King.
Have you done any research on streets that were previously named for like Confederate leaders that have been changed to being commemorating Dr. King, like how that divides the community?
That's a good question. You know, when I first started this work in the 90s, as a young, brash grad student with not much sense, still don't have much sense, I expected there to be this revolution where, you know, they were taking down the name of Jefferson Davis or Nathan Bedford Forrest and they were replacing it with King. That would be high drama, right? And I didn't necessarily find that. In fact, activists have told me They're very strategic about what streets that they take on for renaming. It doesn't mean that that has not happened, but they realize the kind of obstacles they face. And if they have a greater chance of getting a renaming to happen and not run into this sort of competition of memory, then they try to do that. I do think that was it in Selma that Jefferson Davis and Martin Luther King, and then Davis has been replaced by Chestnut, J.L. Chestnut, famous civil rights lawyer. And so it'd be interesting to go back to that moment where that was being questioned or taken on. So I don't necessarily see that as a big pattern. I'm sure it's happened in some places. In Atlanta, they did want to remove a street name that remembered and memorialized Nathan Bedford Forrest, and that went nowhere. They also wanted to rename Auburn Avenue. That also went nowhere, but for different reasons and from different politics. Yeah.
Thanks so much for your talk. I am glad you ended with Baltimore because my question is about MLK Boulevard in Baltimore. I lived there for 12 years. And I guess I was just curious to hear you speak a little bit more. It follows on the previous question about how Martin Luther King Jr.'s name has been also kind of co-opted and remobilized by the state,
Mm-hmm.
which was actively working against him for most of his career, as a mode of pacification. I mean, that road in Baltimore is one of the more violent roads you could argue and say, not in terms of actual violence, but I mean in the sense of what it does to separate
That's right.
Baltimore from we call it like the black butterfly and the white owl. And for a lot of people, I think the naming of that road as MLK Road was seen as a means by the state or the city
Yeah.
to try to pacify the deep intentional segregation of the city through that boulevard.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm just curious if you would.
No, I think it's a great point. I mean, one of the things that I have to realize is that the very same process that I'm hoping can be more just in terms of street naming, at its heart can be easily appropriated and become a mechanism of the state. It also can be a mechanism for development, where we constantly use street and place names for marketing purposes. And I think for me, and this is where, I'm not an expert on Baltimore, but let me say this, that for me it would be about tracing back to that political moment in which that street was chosen and named, and finding out whose voices were included or not, and finding out what was sort of behind those decisions, and trying to interrogate those decisions. But no doubt about it that, and in fact, there's no doubt about it that the street name is sort of a problematic area to think about as a form of resistance because of the way states can take them over. They can use them as tokens. They can try to appease populations. At the same time, I've seen communities actively mobilize to demand and actually win concession from their city council. So I'm not ready to completely give it over to the state. There are some theorists, I work in place name studies, and there are some thinkers and theorists in place name studies that suggest that this whole idea, they're more radical than me, that this whole idea of renaming streets, renaming schools, renaming public buildings, that's just playing the game of the state. And that in fact there needs to be alternative ways in which you create those names and memories to exist on the landscape. Again, I think it very much varies locally and geographically. At my heart, I'm going to always be a geographer, is that you cannot apply the same political model to every place. It really depends on the context. Yeah, I don't know. That's a very good question. I don't know if that helps. Okay. Yeah.
To just sort of decimate it. And as I talk to other people in major urban centers, it seems that is a pattern.
Yeah.
Have you found in your work this pattern of disrupting black communities with where roads and streets are placed?
Yeah.
And then perhaps tagging the MLK on top of it?
I have to give some thought to the second one, but I can tell you that I think some of the gravity of naming streets and renaming streets has everything to do with the role that roads have played within civil rights struggle. For example, let me go to Knoxville, where I live right now, because due to urban renewal, also urban removal of people, community.
Can I just say one thing? So I took our group in here, that's
Yeah.
as outback as you can get.
Yeah.
And I've often pondered, because our family had to move, we had a great community, but we had to move because of urban renewal.
Yeah.
There was nothing urban about us.
Well, exactly. And honestly, amongst those communities in Knoxville who were labeled as blighted, there was not necessarily something blighted about them. But in the case of in the case of Knoxville, and I don't want to speak about your community, you know that better than me, but in the case of Knoxville, they displaced, removed, and tore down institutions. And there's a movement now, and they obliterated streets, and there's a movement now in Knoxville to actually recover the names of those lost streets and to actually place the names of those lost streets onto the existing streets. We're actually in geography using GIS to assist with this. We're laying down the old map of Knoxville on top of a newer map to identify where those streets would be. That's a long way around the barn to say that roads play a pivotal role in civil rights for so long. Many of the activists cite that when they make the proposals to rename streets. And again, this goes to the heart, to my friend's point about the state. It's in those cases where they're really trying to grab control of sort of the process of identifying and in effect owning those streets that have traditionally been used to alienate them and to displace them.
Thank y'all for your questions. We have some
Thank you very much.
questions.